thank you for allowing me to present today. Although I think after Diego's talk, it might be all superfluous. It might not matter. I want to just thank Vet Salis, who conceived of this concept and then helped support it. And I want to also make the emphasis that this is, although we're comparing between two countries, this is absolutely a collaboration and not a competition in any way, shape or form, as will become obvious. I also want to particularly thank, where is he, Robert, because we use most of Robert's data set for this study. So when you look at antimicrobial use, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can look at it, and I'm sure most of you have seen something like this. This is looking at antimicrobial use in agriculture by geographic area, by in this case 10 kilometre square pixels, and bearing in mind that 80% of antimicrobials in the world are used in agriculture. So in this format, obviously it highlights the areas of the world where there's a lot of antimicrobials use, and the denominator is area, not animals. So that's quite good from a social science perspective, but it doesn't really help us from an animal perspective. On the back of that, we published 2 years ago what we thought was, still think it was, the first sort of global benchmarking of antimicrobial use from the data that we could find across the world. And this is mostly collected at a country level, mostly collected from sales data and measured in PCU, so milligrams of antimicrobials per kilogram of biomass. And in each of these countries, it's total biomass, so it includes all species. We particularly like this because, of course, New Zealand comes out the third lowest. So we're quite fixed on this method of analysing antimicrobial use. And in particular in New Zealand, and I think it's true across the world, there was a lot of push from the medics, from the human side of the industry, that the use of antimicrobials in agriculture was significant in terms of AMR, and we still don't know if that's true. But this data was published by Mark Thomas in 2014-2015. This is the similar data set to what I showed you, a sort of semi-global data set of human antimicrobial use, and this was pleasing for us because it highlighted that New Zealand in the human field is actually the third highest user of antimicrobials in the world. So that sort of allowed us a bit of breathing space on the agricultural front when we were talking about AMU. There's other data out there, and so, for example, the top line is the biomass of all of New Zealand, all animals. These other 4 or 5 lines are all dairy cattle, so different versions of dairy cattle. And as you would expect, depending on how you pick those groups, you get different figures. In 2015, the New Zealand Vet Association came up with this aspirational statement, which was met at the time with a mixture of concern, I guess, in some quarters, and also delight in others. So it was quite an aspirational statement that we were going to move towards what appeared to be a zero use of antimicrobials. It was actually quite cleverly crafted to say that what it didn't say was that we wouldn't have any antimicrobials. What it actually means is that we still intend to use them, but we want to have access to them and be able to use them as we see fit. But obviously we want to move towards a lower usage. So, and at the same time, we don't want to compromise animal health and welfare. There's a bit of other stuff in this space. I'll just quickly run through the Sustainable Farming Fund project that we're involved with over 3 years to reduce antimicrobial use. And there's stuff like this that you've probably got in your own practices. This is an antimicrobial use dashboard that we've developed that you can get a drop-down menu and pick clients by year and look at their sales and their use, and you can pick it by different types of antimicrobial. And there's some stuff here from Synergy Animal Health in the UK doing something very similar, going down to a very granular level, looking at antimicrobial use and reporting on it. So in terms of benchmarking AMU across the world, there's a few challenges, and some of these have been identified in previous talks. I won't spend too much time on them. For example, total weight used, we use that at a country level. Our government uses that, but it's very, very clunky. It doesn't really give you much information. We can use cow level, herd level, dose level, sales level, we know all that sort of stuff. And then there's all these different acronyms that everybody loves, calculated cow dose and whatever they are, for defined daily dose and so on and so forth, PCU, I've talked a bit about land area, and the thing that I want to bring into this discussion is production, because we don't often talk about how much antimicrobial we use per output. And bear in mind, we're producing food, and that's an output, and so we should be considerate of that. Every metric has its own bias, and that's an important part, and that was mentioned in the first talk today as well. So what are these biases? Well, the weight of animals. Typically, when you're looking at a herd or a country, obviously you have to standardize the weight, and that's always going to be fraught. So we often don't have individual animal data. And then the number of animals at a biomass level, particularly with the highly reproducing species, so pigs and poultry, it's really hard to standardize what a biomass is at any one time of the year. We also consider things like antimicrobials that are bought. A lot of this is sales data, but may not be used. The caveat to that is that those antibiotics go somewhere in the environment, but we don't know. So perhaps sales is a good handle. And then we need to think about how we manage young stock and what's an effective hectare when we're looking at farms and things like that. The standardization of dry cow use, you'd be familiar with some of that sort of stuff. Depending on how you class dry cow use, and you can end up with 4 times the daily dose rates, and that's very important. And then finally, are we using accurate doses? So this is not without risk in the data. So putting all that to one side, what did we do for this comparative study? So we took 2 large data sets, so our data set from New Zealand and Robert's data set from the UK. Very similar methodology, so both use sales as a proxy for use, both use milligrams of PCU, both measured sales data over the similar 12-month period. And in both cases, the AM data was gathered from clinics and the denominator data from the farms themselves. And in both cases, we removed young stock from the denominator. And what did we find? And I want to emphasize, before I go into this, that this is a collaboration and not a competition in any way. Although if it was a competition, there are some key points here. So we had slightly more dairy farms in the New Zealand study. We had slightly more dairy cows in the New Zealand study. We had slightly more clinics involved in the New Zealand study, and slightly higher proportion of the cows involved in the New Zealand study. This is the beauty of collaboration. And we pulled a bunch of other data out from this, which I'm not going to go into in this, I haven't got time to go into in this study. What was the key thing? And again, it's not about competition, but the high-level PCU between the 2 studies came out at 20.62 in Robert's UK data and 8.54 in our data. What was really interesting was the range at a herd level. So there's this really significant range in the UK data between some very, very low users and some remarkably high users. And for whatever reason in New Zealand, we've got a reasonably tight range, and I'm not quite sure why there should be such a difference. Obviously, in the UK situation, it gives quite a lot of opportunity to move the curve down towards the lower end, so that's quite interesting. Similar in both studies was that injection was the greatest route, and that's really interesting given Diego's recent talk. And in both studies, beta-lactams were by far the largest category of antimicrobials. Second largest was aminoglycosides in the UK and macrolides in New Zealand. But the devil is always in the detail with this data, and I think it's unfair to stop there. And the first issue there is weight. So in Robert's study, he used the ESVAC standardized weight for dairy cows, 425 kilograms. And for those of you that work in the UK, I think you would all agree that 425 kilograms for a UK cow is slightly low. And we used the New Zealand standardized weight, which is 458. And for those of you that ever worked in New Zealand and the UK, you'd find it hard to believe that New Zealand cows are heavier at any stage of their life than UK dairy cows. So without getting into too much detail, how can we standardize this? What would be more realistic? So putting into some data, there's lots of figures coming out of other data sets and some of Robert's data suggesting that cows might be 650 kgs or whatever. If you correct this and say that the UK cows have a mean of 625 kgs, and I bow to the UK members of the audience, that significantly changes PCU. And just to highlight the fact that weights are highly important when it comes to benchmarking across herds and countries. But I don't think we should stop there, because we need to look at production. And as I say, we are looking at a produced output. We're looking at a food production, so we should really standardise by production. Now, the UK mean, we had data from Robert's study of some of the actual hares, but we didn't have all the hare production data. So again, we've gone back, pulled slightly back and taken the UK mean production for that year was about 7,700 litres, or 670 kilograms of milk solids. That's how Kiwis would probably recognise that. New Zealand average production for the same period was significantly less. And if you correct that PCU from that data by production, you actually come out with a UK PCU, which is 6.5, which is actually lower than the New Zealand figure. Now, I couldn't possibly present this in New Zealand, but I'm happy to fly halfway around the world and present this here safely. So I guess the summary, and I've kind of rushed through it. There's a lot more interesting stuff in the detail, but the summary is this: it's interesting when you start to compare across countries. It's different systems, different outputs. But I guess the take-home message is that when you really dive down into the data and start to pull it apart and correct for obvious differences, it's remarkably similar across both countries and both production systems. There's also remarkably similar patterns in the data set. So the whole concept that injectables is a significant part is very true. This is a picture out of Robert's paper, and we've seen exactly the same in New Zealand. And again, after Diego's talk, I think this is really important. And we all know that udder health, mastitis treatments are a huge part of what we use antimicrobials for. And the final point I want to make is that the challenge with all of this stuff is getting data in real time. So this is already old data. It's 2 or 3 years old now. And we already know from more recent data that in both countries, the antimicrobial use is dropping quite markedly, actually. So the other take-home messages I just want to just consider is that when you talk about PCU, obviously weight is important, both in the animal side and on the numerator side, on the milligrams used, and it's not all about weight. Obviously, penicillins and beta-lactams are particularly heavy antimicrobials, so you can reduce your PCU by moving to third-generation cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones, but that's not exactly what we're after. We know that udder health has the biggest impact. There's plenty of opportunities to consider how we standardise methodologies when we start to move between countries. And as I say, there's lots of detail in the data, which is for a separate talk, but it becomes really quite fascinating. And so with that, I'll leave you for some questions. Thank you.